Protests erupted in Louisville, Kentucky this week over a grand jury ruling in the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor. The grand jury decided that none of the 3 white officers involved in the fatal police raid on Taylor's apartment would be charged directly for her death, but one officer was indicted on charges of endangering her neighbors. The 26-year-old black emergency medical technician and an aspiring nurse was killed in front of her armed boyfriend, and this after the 3 officers forced their way into the home with a search warrant in a drug trafficking investigation. Joining us now to discuss the court and race politics in the U.S. is Devin Barrington-Ward, Managing Director of the Black Futurists Group, who is also a former Georgian State Senate candidate. Devin, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsfeed Late Night. So, Devin, a 26-year-old emergency worker was shot in her house while she was in her bed. And the jury says the only thing that went wrong here is that one of the officers shot from outside and endangered the life of the neighbor. What went wrong?
What went wrong is what continues to go wrong here when we continue to seek justice through an unjust system, a system from its inception that was developed on the backs of black and brown and indigenous people here in this country. And so what we saw was the ramifications of a justice system that is grounded in racism, grounded in white supremacy, and grounded in ignoring the concerns of black people. And unfortunately, the latest victim of that was Breonna Taylor, killed on March 13th, my birthday. And when I woke up and heard the news of what had happened in Louisville, I was so saddened because this has happened before. In Atlanta, we saw a 92-year-old black grandmother who was killed in 2006 by police with a botched no-knock warrant, where they recognized after the fact that the people that they were actually looking for was not at that location, and it was the wrong home. And so this is quite common in the United States. It is unfortunate that we had to learn about all of the many contributions that Breonna Taylor was making to her community as an EMT, as a paramedic in the midst of a pandemic. We can't afford to lose any frontline worker, but particularly a frontline worker like Breonna Taylor, a black woman in this country.
Well, what does that say about the rule of law, the fact that police can come into your house, find you in your bed, shoot you, and be found not guilty?
Well, it's not necessarily reflective of the total rule of law. In America, there is oftentimes 2 justice systems. There's the justice system for the rich, the powerful, the white, folks who are white, and folks whose power and connections afford them a certain ability of having to go through the criminal justice system in a way that is envisioned and outlined in all of our guiding documents in this country. And then we know that we have a justice system that is for others, folks who are black, folks who are poor, folks who are marginalized, people who are seen as othered in this country. And so because of that, this justice system was the justice system that was extended to Breonna Taylor, but that is not what would have happened if Breonna Taylor was white. And the example of that is the officer who was charged with discharging his weapon in a way that was dangerous and endangered the life of her white neighbors. And if that is not a slap in the face, I don't know what is.
Now, those who commit these murders also write the reports. Now, how transparent and how independent was this process of writing a report into the murder of Breonna Taylor?
So the report from the police officers is what informed the Kentucky State Attorney General's investigation, and is also what's going to serve as the basis for all of the other investigations that are still ongoing with the FBI and the federal administration. But many of us don't have trust that the federal administration under this president, who has doubled down on his support for law enforcement even after their reckless endangerment of black and brown residents in this country, we don't really have the faith that these other investigations we will see a different outcome. But the problem is that police are responsible for policing themselves. And what we continue to see over and over again is that the most dangerous police officers, the officers with the most criminal background, the officers with the most infractions, the officers with the most charges of police brutality and harming folks in our communities are oftentimes the officers that are intentionally placed in black and brown communities and intentionally sent out to terrorize folks. And so we have to call out what we see for what it is. And the United States is turning into a police state overnight. And it is a responsibility for those of us who believe in freedom and liberation to stand up, to fight back, and to dismantle this system piece by piece. And what that means is defunding police departments. The police departments do way too much work, and the entirety, folks think that police are supposed to protect your life, protect property, and that is extended to all citizens. But what we've seen is that from the inception of the first police department in this country, the Charleston Watch, which was responsible in South Carolina for tracking down fugitive slaves. And so from there, we see the police system has always been rooted in the over-policing and the criminalization and the taking away the liberty of Black people in this country.
What is the Louisville Police Department saying about the fact that they were acting on a tip of some sort of drug trafficking that was going on there? But it's emerged that Breonna's boyfriend was not a drug dealer.
Well, they were a part of the investigation was focused on her previous lover, her ex-boyfriend, who they already had in custody the night that they executed that warrant. And so it was sloppy police work, but we always see sloppy police work when it involves Black people. But in addition to that, it is a reflector of how the war on drugs in this country, which inherently targets Black people, brown people, indigenous people, that the war on drugs of this country, if we were not waging the war on drugs in the ways in which we wage it, without services, without mental health support, substance abuse services, and things of that nature, instead we wage the war on drugs not as a public health issue, but we wage it as a criminal justice issue and a law enforcement issue. And so instead of services for communities that are impacted by the war on drugs, we see battering rams, we see more chaos, we see more trauma, and we see the police brutalizing people. And oftentimes those victims and communities that are victimized by this police brutality are the same communities that have always had these high rates of drug overdoses, the same communities that have had these high rates of mass incarceration. And it is an endless cycle, and it is a circle. And we must end our collusion with this war on drugs, and that means that we must end our reliance on the police as being the stalwart protectors of public safety. Public safety doesn't start with police. It starts with people.
Now, tell me, what is your opinion? If these were 3 Black police officers, would a similar verdict have come out?
No, because when police officers are held accountable in this country, overwhelmingly they are Black and brown police officers or police officers of minority descent. And so we know that if the roles were reversed and these were 3 Black police officers and an innocent white woman was killed, that there would be a completely different set of charges. There would be a completely different set of intentionality by the criminal justice system to gain accountability and justice for the victim. But because Breonna Taylor is a Black woman, because Breonna Taylor is not rich, because Breonna Taylor is not perceived by the system as being powerful, because Breonna Taylor is not seen as being loved and valued in her community by the system, it was very easy for the system to empower police officers to move in the ways that they did, which resulted in the death of Breonna Taylor.
Of course, we've seen Louisville erupting in protest. New York has seen some protests. Portland has seen some protests. And there are reports of 127 or so, maybe even more, people being arrested right now. Are those protests going to continue?
I believe that the protests will continue. Right now, the United States is in a season of uprising, and we will continue to uprise until the voices of the people are heard. People are tired of the status quo. People are tired of the promises that are broken, and people are tired of feeling powerless. And so people taking into the streets, but also taking that energy into the streets in the upcoming election is what is going to shift things towards more freedom and liberation. Make no mistake about it. No one is relying on Joe Biden to end all police brutality, because the office of the president, as much power as it has, it does not have that specific power. It can influence, but the power really relies in state and local communities and local government. And so people have to take back the power of their local governments, because the local government is the one that is the closest to the people. But we are oftentimes seeing that the local government is employing and empowering local police departments to move brazen and in ways that rival that of our military. And oftentimes we actually see a connection between our military and local policing, because much of that heavy equipment that police use to brutalize folks in drug investigations and search and seizure warrants with battering rams and tanks to respond to public uprising after they have killed someone unjustifiably, that much of that equipment is donated and refurbished from the U.S. military. And so we're seeing that our foreign policy also influences the ways in which we move with people who are citizens in this country, but the system oftentimes doesn't look at them as citizens. They look at them as a foreign occupation force and uses local police departments to terrorize those communities.
Now, Devin, no knock, no warrant, unrelated suspect already in custody. You've got police that did not announce themselves. You've got a boyfriend who pulls out his legal firearm to defend himself from people who are potentially breaking in. And then you've got Brianna, who is then shot. And the fact that police tried to cover this all up. Now, we've seen some senators responding to this. We've seen some Democrats talking about this on social media. What has President Trump said about this?
President Trump has his only statement was that he was in alignment with the Louisville, Kentucky Police Department and was sending prayers to 2 police officers who were shot yesterday, a non-life threatening, who were shot yesterday during the demonstrations after the verdict. The President Trump has said nothing specifically about what has happened to Breonna Taylor. President Trump oftentimes uses this to whip up his base, to double down on his support for law enforcement, because he feels as though that is going to be his pathway into the White House. But for those of us who are political observers and have looked at the numbers, this president didn't win by a landslide in 2016. He won certain key states by 30, 40,000 votes. And in the grand scheme of a national election, that is a small amount of votes. This is a president that did not win the popular vote. And so I think President Trump is playing with fire, and this may indeed blow up in his face with a loss in November in our upcoming election.